Hello, hello, hello. It's been a while since we've heard that little welcome song, but Brent has frozen, so that's not great. Off to a good start, I see. Maybe a little rusty, but welcome to Watching Privacy 2023 year in recap. We got Raju and Brent here as always, and I would say we dive in, but maybe we'll try to figure out what's going on with Brent in the meantime. Let's see. Maybe he'll come back around. I think, Roger, you and I can kind of get started. I thought it would be kind of a good idea in general to maybe we'll talk about this in kind of three different little sections. We'll talk about maybe some of our favorite stories from this past year, maybe most important, maybe favorite, maybe funniest, maybe scariest, who knows. And then we can dive into a little bit about privacy and AI, since that's going to be kind of the hype of the year, I would say. And then we can end with a few things that we think are in store for the future for 2024 and beyond. I guess I will. I mean, I'll kick off one of mine that I thought was interesting. It was definitely a smaller story in terms of like global news, but I think it is more of a reflection of kind of what companies are up to. And it was about a small little change that Google Maps actually did, where they changed the URL pattern. So before, if you ever wanted to access Google Maps, you would go to maps.google.com. And now when you go to maps.google.com, it redirects you to google.com/maps. Most people probably think that this is kind of like an insignificant change, but I think it's actually probably one of the scariest and biggest changes that was silently rolled out that almost nobody really cares or knows about. And the reason for that is basically, without getting too technical, my understanding is that the way cookies and the way permissions in a browser work is all based on the domain. And so when you have google.com/maps, that means you're providing access to whatever resources, your location, your camera, your microphone, whatever it is, to the top level google.com domain, and any subfolder like /maps/work drive or /drive/books or podcast or whatever it is, anything after google.com is all treated as google.com. So when you give permission to Maps to have your location, Gmail actually gets your location. If you give permission to use your camera and microphone in Meet, if you're still using Google Meet for some crazy reason, that means Maps has access to that. As opposed to the other version, when it was maps.google.com, maps.google.com is a different domain altogether. And so permissions are isolated to that kind of subdomain. And I think it's, it kind of goes back down to cookies and tracking, as a lot of people are restricting third-party cookie access. It's a smart move on Google, and I mean, it was an inevitable move, really, to make sure that everything is served from the top level Google domain, and they can track you across every Google property a lot easier. Roger, you probably have a little bit more insight into the nuts and bolts of it. What do you think of that one? And you're muted. We're just really rusty here.
Yeah, I think it's the same concept that we have seen from various companies where they're trying.
We fix one, we lose another.
It is really strange. I was hoping it was just me, but wow, this is really interesting.
Yeah, you sent your problems over to Raju.
I missed out on it sounded like you were talking about something around Google, of course, but I didn't know exactly what it was.
Yeah, I was saying how Google changed the URL for Maps from maps.google.com to google.com/maps, and ultimately that gives them the ability to create first-party cookies on any google.com property and not letting maps.google.com be different. And so it's a small, subtle change. Nobody realizes, doesn't affect anybody, or don't think they affect everybody, but it actually obviously impacts everybody in that regard. Raju, we can see you blinking, so I think you're good now.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So I was saying, it's Google aggregating data across their properties.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I generally don't log into any Google account or any of the apps, but there's one time I tried in one of my newer devices, logged into one application, and then it'll automatically log me into multiple applications. Or maybe that's a common behavior. I don't know, but all it means is it has a lot of properties, and it's trying to aggregate all information across these properties and knit them together. And that is a trend that we are seeing across the board. Some of the information that they may not have, expect some acquisitions, and that's a new data lake that they're buying in and putting it into the system. That is one trend I certainly expect to see, where a lot of companies will recognize the information that they do not have and acquire those companies and build up that, because especially with AI, which we'll discuss, it's no longer about it, it's a lot about the data that you have. It's not just about the models and some of those out there. So I'm not surprised Google is doing it. They're just now a little blatant about it.
Mm. Do we know, like, you see all this single sign on stuff now? Well, more than ever. It's been around for a while, but I started thinking, as I sign in, because I still use Google for a number of things. I've got YouTube TV, I've got premium YouTube. Like I'm scarily all bought into a lot of stuff here. But as you see these new websites come up, and a lot of them are using, the single sign on, and Google is one of the main ones. What impact is that having on Google's access to data across the world, when all these websites are really using them as a single sign-on? What data does that unlock for Google, having that kind of access to all these websites that are using them as the way to log in?
When you have a Google sign on, that's another Trojan horse. Remember, in the past we talked about Google Analytics. Everybody has Google Analytics, and they're using that data to aggregate all of that. We talked about Google Fonts being another Trojan horse. Single sign-on is another Trojan horse, where Google knows where somebody is logging in from, and the location, the application they're using, how much time they're spending, and all of that. I mean, that is yet another Trojan horse out there. And most of these single sign-on companies, have an ad-based business model. So these are all various Trojan horses that they have deployed across the board, and they're aggregating that information now in the name of making it easy, right? And we have seen that. Like, another example we have seen is in the browser. You don't have to go to google.com and search. You can search in your URL bar. Well, what that really means is every single key press is being sent back to Google or whoever the provider is. That's another Trojan horse. So it's an aggregation of various Trojan horses used to aggregate user information, of course, without uh, their permission, or explicit permission, I should say. The scary thing to me is the speed at which data aggregation is happening. And, or put it a different way, the data aggregation is happening at the speed of light, and privacy abuse is happening at the speed of light. But the things like privacy law are happening at a speed of a snail. So there's a contrast there, and it's not getting any better.
Yeah, I think the connection. I mean, I think AI will probably enable the connections to happen even more and quicker. So it'll be not a good snowball effect there. uh, what do you call? Roger, you want to talk about your story? Brent, who wants to go first or second? I guess whatever.
Sure. I mean, I think at a high level, there are a couple of things that kind of I was not happy to see. One, now, if you look at what is the most personal information about an individual, you can say biometric, but even one level deeper, your DNA data. The fact that DNA data is out there with 23andMe, exposing their customers' information, and that was bad. Not to mention that they updated the terms and service, and in such a way that the customers cannot even sue them. They send out an email to all their customers saying that, hey, if you do not respond to this email, saying that you do not you do not agree to the new terms, this means you automatically agree to the old terms, or automatically agree to the new terms. So that that was even shadier. That some of the most private information about individuals being out in the public is scary. And I thought that was one. The second story, it wasn't covered much in the Western media, there is about another leak that happened in India. So India has something called Aadhaar, which is like social security, and information about 800 plus million people were exposed, and 800 million people, right? That's about 2.5 times of US,
Yeah.
and that includes the biometric information. So biometric information about 800 plus million people. Now, what's happening to all this data? So your biometric data with, let's say, something like Aadhaar, or if you take your private data like DNA, it's like most of the private data is getting out there, and now assume that that is being aggregated, and who knows how it is being used. To me, those were the scarier ones this year. There are probably multiple, but those stood out. In the previous years, it did not get to leak of much of a biometric data, maybe facial to some extent, but not at this level. Every single fingerprint and your DNA data being out there is a major negative impact when it comes to privacy in 2023.
I think also it doesn't help that most people don't care. Pretty short in the news cycle, not like that crazy, or I guess the uproar about it is small. People will get, I guess, more of a emotional or visceral reaction to probably less impactful stories when this is something that I wouldn't say threatens, but definitely impacts pretty much everybody. I mean, the 23andMe story is just bad because I think they had a bad 2023 in general, because I think the way they basically disclosed the leak in the first place, and then they started adding more details after there was like an SEC filing, and like it was just like not a good response by them whatsoever. And I think ultimately the sad thing is, who cares? Like the fact that there's no accountability really there, it's like we don't really have to be that responsive, and most people will probably forget about it. And the few that do, I guess, pay attention, they probably wouldn't have gotten them as customers, or that's just like the small, operating loss that they're probably okay losing out on. But generally, like the fact that these stories aren't bigger, especially, other 800 million. Honestly, like I remember reading the article once and then kind of just off the radar. And it could be
Moving
just because it's
on,
India
right?
and not here, but like, yeah, just
Yeah.
not a big deal. 23andMe stayed in the news a little bit, but again, if you paid attention to this stuff, you would have heard about it, but most people probably would have never even known that story ever happened at all. Or maybe you got an
And then
email.
there is an additional dimension to it. 23andMe is a private company exposing the information. They're going to be get sued, and maybe something will happen where they kind of reaches a settlement, whatever that means.
You'll
The
get
end user
97
is not
cents.
going to be 97 cents, right? But the India story was interesting, or interesting may not be the right word. Was important because what happens when the government loses your data? This is a government who is suing them, and what are the repercussions of that? And
Hmm.
that's an unknown territory, and it's going to be interesting to see how that develops.
Are you guys hearing me? Because I think my connection keeps going in and out. The lead is like that on my end, but I'm not sure. Let me know if you can't hear me, then you wouldn't really be able to let me know. Anyway, so this year for me, it's been, from a privacy perspective, it feels like we're just starting down the path of this deep hole where we don't know what the bottom is, where it comes to what depth people can go to leverage our data to get, and then to use it in all sorts of, the word we haven't said this year so far, nefarious ways. And you just point out a couple of examples, but it feels like, along with the way people look at Gen AI in terms of, well, we don't know what can be done with it because it's all still new to us. It almost feels like that one, in terms of how many different ways can we be ripped off, taken advantage of, as more and more people start to use these tools. And the tremendous access to data, it feels like data is just, you can just hold up your hand and just scoop up a whole bunch of
I think we may have lost Brent.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, the sentiment is right. The fact that this is happening more and more. I mean, I I think I started creating a list and then kind of got a little overwhelmed. But I mean, even this year there was a T-Mobile one that had a big security breach. I want to say somewhere around 30, 40 million probably customers' information. I remember Hilton had one. That was another probably 5 million information, and the Hilton one had like information about stays and stuff like that. So that's even worse than just like your account information. Experian had one. I think we got that payout and settlement happened, and so I mean, it happens pretty frequently. The consequences probably aren't severe enough. Even even like I guess Experian and T-Mobile operate here in the U.S., so the blowback is not that much. And then I also did some digging on like fines in general, and like the fines are just like not even proportional to what the issue is. I mean, there was, uh, I think, a big one. So Zoom finally paid out a fine, and these guys had some like security and privacy issues during the pandemic. Maybe you give them a little bit of a pass because pandemic was crazy and like maybe they were moving pretty fast. But I mean, these guys got fined $85 million, and I mean, Zoom makes an insane amount of money, and especially in that time when they were printing money and the stock was through the roof, 85 million is like nothing. These guys probably spend more sponsoring F1 than they do on that fine alone. So like the if the punishment isn't there, then there's no incentive to really change your kind of actions, right? It's just a simple cost of doing business.
What were the other bigger fines?
Let's see. So the biggest one I found was I mean, mostly in Europe. So there was one against Facebook or Meta. That was about 1.3 billion for anti-competitive behavior for online ads, not necessarily privacy related, but just kind of a tech fine. TikTok got fined by the EU for failing to comply with GDPR requirements for children's data, and that was 378 million. Meta got another one from the EU for like 400 some odd million for some GDPR violations. Amazon got hit for 800 million by the EU for some antitrust stuff. So again, not really privacy related, but just tech related. I think interesting. Didi from China, they got a 1.2 billion dollar fine for data security and violations for improper data collection. I thought that was the pot calling the kettle black there. If China's out here finding somebody, one of their own people, 1.2 billion on it. T-Mobile had $500 million on their data breach. Capital One had like 200 million on data breach. I think Google had like 150, 175 on location tracking for Android. I mean, they sound like big numbers, but I mean, obviously there's a long appeals process. How much actually gets paid? Not, I mean, yeah, not enough or not proportional enough where it stings and it's like, oh, we actually got to like fix this at a root level.
Interesting numbers, completely unrelated. You know, how much did US pay to buy Alaska? Inflation adjusted, I think it comes down to about 125 million. So in other words, Meta paid 10 times that price as a fine than what US paid to buy Alaska, inflation adjusted.
Can you guys? Am I back? It looks like I might be back. I'm not sure.
Yes,
but-
Brent.
Okay. Sorry, I don't know what's going on. I thought I paid my my Spectrum cable bill, but maybe I didn't. But what you just touched on, though, even the fines are ridiculous when it comes to the amount of money they stand to make on these activities compared to the fines. It's like, yeah, you how much you want to? All right, yeah, you want it in cash? Sure, we'll keep paying that. You know, because as long as we get to keep using the data, I mean, there's so many things going against real privacy. What do you call it? Reimagining, I guess. From the latency in terms of how long it takes for governments to try to do regulations of any sort to the kind of fines that they're paying, they're putting on these folks for doing it. Everything is kind of lined up against privacy. And then what Tejas said too, individuals, particularly the younger folks, they're not really concerned about this stuff for the most part. and maybe that's why it feels like all this last year everybody's been talking about Gen AI, um, and you hear some things pop up, but it's mostly around like intellectual property, like using what the public domain has to create stuff, and then you try to monetize that stuff, and then the people who created the stuff originally that goes into Chat GPT, they get mad. But that's not necessarily a privacy issue. That's more of a like an economic issue, or a business model issue, as opposed to a privacy issue. And it feels like that has been mostly of the concern more than privacy has over this point. At least that's how it feels like to me so far.
Yeah, I think you dropped a good nugget in there too, Brent. The fine is like a slap on the wrist. The actual punishment should be like deletion of data, or something more impactful, right? If you just get a fine, that's just like a very simple. It's like when you get in trouble and someone says, "Just say you're sorry." That doesn't actually like fix the problem or what you did wrong. That's just say you're sorry and move on. And so if the punishments were more inclined to like, all right, you have to delete the data and maybe go over above, do something, but ultimately the fine, I mean, we've talked about this before, but the fine is a cost of doing business in terms of pushing the envelope or trying things that either or aren't wrong. But more importantly, it's kind of like, cool, we know this is wrong, but I really think probably 200 million fine, maybe 500 million fine is worth it if we can basically get whatever we can out of this and then move on. Like that's just like it's like buying a data set basically. And so you've cost it in there. And I know, I mean, especially for companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon, like I've spoken with like people who run product, PMs, engineers. Nothing happens on those development teams and engineering teams that doesn't run through legal. So when they have a new feature idea or new something else, legal is always reviewing these things and in their mind on it. So it's not like some you can say that the idea of this feature, this capability, or this connection was created in good faith, and we just happened to find out it was not, not legal. But these guys basically greenlight it all. And that's the worst part. I mean, someone is literally out here reviewing things rather than an innocent mistake, right?
Yeah, and I think we discussed this in in the past in some of the previous episodes. A better way to implement this is as a percentage of revenue on an annual basis till that is rectified, and so it keeps on going till the company fixes it. Otherwise, it just becomes a cost of doing business.
Doesn't it feel like the more we go along, because the speed of technology and the speed of adoption of technology is so far beyond the speed of government with regulation and doing something as simple and as logical as what you just said, Raju? Wouldn't it make more sense than paying just a dollar amount, a percentage amount, because that's going to make you think more about it. At least it feels like there's some easy things that could be done, but takes way too long. And in between the time they actually get stuff done, other things have moved, quicker and faster and made things even more out of alignment with privacy concerns, basically.
Yeah, what we've seen in 2023 was, at least in 2022, we saw that some of these countries were coming up with privacy laws and whatnot. All of a sudden, there is a new kid in town called AI that took the precedence, and that became a priority across the board, and it's moving at a much faster pace. And I think 2024 we may see the intersection of these two, but we'll see. But I think that took some focus away from privacy. At least the AI focus is become much higher priority compared to the privacy focus. And these are connected, but it's always the people who are setting up the rules in the government do not know technology, and that doesn't help, and the implications are unknown. I think it's tough to control and set up laws for technology, but I think it's important to at least set some rules on its implications. Does it hurt the end user, or does it help? Does the end user still have the freedom? Can they protect their information? And if you do it at that level, and not which technology to use and the pace of innovation, none of that stuff, then it'll likely be fine.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. I mean, realistically, I mean, we'll talk about this maybe closer to the end for what we see in the future, but I think you won't. I mean, because next year's an election year in the U.S., I don't think you see any kind of legislation about this whatsoever, and it's almost like not even in, I would say, like Congress's best interest to enact any kind of privacy stuff. It's kind of like how they don't do like banning stock trades, right? Like on a tangent, but for the privacy stuff, ultimately, like most campaigns spend their money on advertising. And for effective advertising, you need to target people. And if you sit here and say that, you know, privacy is going to be something we protect, we're not going to be able to target as well. And then the money's not going to be as effective, right? Like it's almost like not in your best interest. You want to be able to target and do it. That's not like the most, I'm sure everyone doesn't have that single polar reason for not doing something about it, but it's most campaigns generally rely on Facebook, Google, Instagram, all these social sites to basically reach their audiences. And if you try to limit that in any way, shape, or form, it's just not in your best interest, right? So that with the election year, I mean, I don't think we really see much going forward. But I think in general, for the AI aspect, yeah, I mean, this year has been big on that front. I think the good thing is we've seen a lot of corporate companies, or corporations in general, not really want to lean too much into AI in terms of like their own in-house proprietary data. We'll probably see maybe some innovation there probably in the next year. Maybe there's more on-premise large language models. Generally, when it comes to AI stuff, I would think that there's kind of like two tiers of services or value you can kind of get. The bottom tier is kind of the low-hanging fruit. How can you make my day-to-day life easier? Every company has data in a million different places. Can we connect it all? Is it easy to find? If I need to figure out who's the engineer on this feature, can I like figure that out very quickly? You know, there's connecting the dots and kind of making things a little bit easier just from a quality of life perspective, because of like data fragmentation. The second one and the more valuable one is actually getting true like organizational insights into what's going on, connecting all the dots that nobody's and answering questions that nobody's even asking. And that's where people probably are obviously a lot more cautious about sharing their own data. And you know, even when OpenAI launched like corporate accounts earlier this year, everyone was worried about, is my data going to get trained? Are the prompts that I'm sending getting added over there? Make sure that there's an opt out. And ultimately, if every company wants to opt out of it, I think that's a good thing. You take their word at it that it's opted out, but at least like, especially with models like this, I think if I was them, I would say, look, we'll let people say they're opting out. Maybe we accidentally don't opt them out and it trains the model, and we get hit with a fine, and that's okay because it's kind of like a first mover advantage. And you can't even have the option to delete the data that was added to the model because the model's been trained, and then there's no like, it's not like a plug and play thing where you just like delete those like tables or whatever and let it out. And so, I mean, that's just the smartest move in the world, right? Like you want to collect as much as you possibly can. You give a guise of kind of security and privacy in place, and then you say, "Oops, my bad. Someone did something wrong, or something was off." And now we just have a you know, the best model got even better, or any model got better, and you go that way. That just seems like the natural way of a business approach to it. What do you guys think?
Yeah, what you're saying is data lakes are built with information. Obviously, we know information that is collected from people without their permission. Now, what AI is doing is building is being built, and the models are being trained with information collected from the data lakes without their permission. And the consumer is basically the loser. And we have seen this trend in the past. Right? Take our friends at Clearview AI. They happen to have the right name at the right wave, AI wave, right? So that's what they did. They collected the information about all the facial recognition of various people, and and now every company wants to be a Clearview AI, collecting all the information without their permission and all of that. In some of these ad companies, they want to be probably a multimodal uh, Clearview, meaning it's not just facial recognition, any recognition for that matter, across various formats. and various pieces of data, aggregate it, pull it, and use that to train the model. And that's where we are headed. And that is the scary part about the AI, how all that information can be aggregated easily. It's no longer manual data models that are connecting licensing data and pulling all the data, including the hundreds of millions of data that is being leaked and that is being pulled in as yet another data source to these AI models. If you look at all of these and combine them together, it's that's a scary territory where AI can make sense of that data instead of people manually building up those data lakes. I think that is the evolution and the impact of AI, and I don't think it's going to help on the privacy side unless there are these privacy protecting technologies that come in that use the same set of technologies where you AI knows how much of your information is out there, and if there is a law that comes in and says provide the provide the control back to the user, where companies are supposed to be using this technology to give the privacy back to the user. And I think that is an area where some of these laws could help, but I'm not holding my breath for those to pass.
It almost feels like what kind of the storyline that played out with that whole open AI firing of Sam Altman. The makeup of the original board was part nonprofit and part technology and business focus. And when it came down to which would win out, should we try to use this stuff more responsibly? Are you really using this responsibly versus we have the technology, we can really do some really interesting stuff? What seemed to have won out? At first it was like, oh, he got fired, and it was because the board said they couldn't trust him, basically. But it sounded like the technology side and the business side wanted to go 1,000 miles an hour. The kind of responsibility portion of the board was like, we should slow things down and make sure we got this right. And we saw what won out. It wasn't the responsible side. And it just feels like there's so much at stake, and it's not just everybody, but these huge big companies have a lot at stake and want to drive forward. Privacy and responsibility is not the same level. And am I reading that wrong? And it feels like if there was a overarching will to make privacy at the forefront, it could be done either from the big business perspective or from the governmental perspective, regulation. But there's too many forces, it feels like, that are against really putting that on the same footing as some of the other things, like revenues and profit. And I don't see that changing. I see 2024 being a year of really just more posturing and more kind of positioning, but not huge movement. And once again, even if privacy stays even, it loses out because the technology and the incentives are constantly accelerating.
I mean, I think it's worse because I think all of this is a race and not a marathon, a sprint. And it is figure out what you can do, break whatever rules you have to, but get whatever you can while you can. And that race is in full effect. I think some people will know about it, some people won't. I remember earlier this year there was that whole issue with Zoom. Basically, Zoom was like they added like a line in their terms of service to train on like all your meeting data, right? And now that got a blip of attention, and I think Zoom kind of backtracked a little bit and said maybe they wouldn't do it unless you opted in for it or whatever made some way. But more and more companies will just slide in language in their terms of service. Many probably already have that your data can be used for other purposes or for the purposes of making the product better or for training or whatever it is, and all of that feeds into whatever systems there is. And I think also you probably have a pretty big gap between, I would say, like, let's say tier one knowledgeable folks about how these systems really work which is maybe 10%, maybe less of the general, like let's say engineering or like people in the tech space, and the other 90% have a basic understanding, but I don't think they really know what goes on into building these models and how they're actually constructed and how much data, like once it's in there, you can't pull it out, and kind of the entire like idea of it. Everyone just calls it AI and it's like, oh my god, it's like this thing, but a lot of people don't really know, I guess, the implications of it. And because it's feed it whatever you possibly can, make it like a vacuum, suck it all up, and then eventually it'll I mean naturally it'll get better with more data. But we also see that like Quora and Reddit, all of these folks that basically got, I would say, sideswiped or blindsided by OpenAI and other LLMs that basically just scraped every single piece of content from their sites for absolute free, and then now they turned off access. But like whatever happened happened. Like that data is already gone, and you can't like undo that, right? Which is ironic too, because you have companies like Facebook. I think they sued somebody earlier this year for scraping public profile pictures or profile pages of Facebook accounts. Which I mean, Facebook and LinkedIn, they're usually pretty big litigators on the idea of scraping. But a little pot calling the kettle black there. LinkedIn, owned by Microsoft, running OpenAI, is out here scraping everybody, and Facebook obviously scraping data left and right from online activity and other third party sources to make their Llama LLM better. So I mean, yeah, I think the race is on in full effect, and I think it's almost worse because any sense of that responsibility aspect, not in like the grand scheme of like is AGI and is AI going to change the world, but literally just is this the right thing to do? Are privacy implications or considerations taken into account? I think all that goes out the window. It's just sprint, 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 and we'll see just a lot of people, small blips of maybe upset people, but I don't think it really hits the major radars of most folks because it's such a bad. Like people won't really feel the sting, like consumers won't. So then you kind of just assume that nothing bad ever really happened until something bad actually happens.
Yeah, I think Tejas hit it on the nail. That is spot on. If you look at where AI is going, all the models, there are a ton of models out there, and most of the good open source models out there. And down the lane, we can predict that most models are going to be free and most models are going to be available. Where the value is going to come from is the data. So everyone is trying to do that sprint to aggregate as much data as possible, and extend the laws, or at least use the existing terms or tweak the terms to make sure that they have advantage over it. And did you ever wonder, like we have heard this phrase several times saying your information will only be used for training purposes and whatnot, right? Will it be do you think it will not be interpreted as training the model? When you say training purposes, could training the model be included in there? Well, it's
That's
not
not training
explicit.
humans, right? It's training the model, right?
Exactly. Don't be surprised. It's probably happening. So I think it's a wild west yet again, at a on steroids currently, for grabbing as much data as possible. And that is the reason virtual walls are coming up, where some of these data aggregators themselves are putting up restrictions. Twitter did that, Reddit did that, and several other companies are doing that, and that will go down the path, and that will likely happen, even particularly in the enterprise spaces. And as an implication, one of the trend I think we'll see in 2024 is the pendulum will swing back to on-premise cloud, because now we are seeing the uh, real negative side effects of the public clouds, because all the data is in the public clouds. Now they're using that data for various purposes. Now now the best way to solve that is to go back to the private clouds, and it'll likely be these enterprises that'll move first now. And there are other implications out there. Now public clouds have become really expensive out there, and they realize that, hey, it's cheaper to go back to my private cloud and get, take advantage of it, still use public cloud for some things here and there. And more importantly, if data is where the value is, and every company will want to control their data. All these privacy abusing companies are not putting their own data on their public clouds, or at least available for others to scrape and use and whatnot. So that's something that we should expect in 2024.
I'm still, things changed so dramatically when ChatGPT was dropped by OpenAI. It's hard to believe it's only been like a year, right? Just imagine if something else happens that completely, once again, we were going like this. ChatGPT, OpenAI kind of made things like this. Who's not to say something else that nobody can see will have, I don't know if it'll have that kind of impact, but can have at least a market impact that changes the trajectory once again. And once again puts all the movement that traditionally takes years, makes it even slower. I mean, is there any end in sight to how far out of sync the privacy and responsibility can get because of the technology allows individuals as well as companies to do things and get away with things that they might not have been able to get away with even a year ago?
I think the chat GPT and its rapid ascent to me is one of the indications of the quickening cycle of a technology. How long did it take for, say, refrigerators to hit 100 million consumers, or TVs for that matter? And then fast forward, how long did it take for computers to get to 100 million users? And all the way to smartphone, how long did it take for the smartphones to get to 100 million users? Versus even something like, you know, so some games got to 100 million users much faster. Say WhatsApp got to 100 million users much faster than, say, Facebook gotten, right? And if you play down that, now just that OpenAI got to 100 million users faster than anyone else prior to that. Just like the prior technology change got to 100 million users faster than that. So it is the same arc of adoption. And I'm expecting the next technology to be adopted, or at least groundbreaking technology to be adopted faster than ChatGPT. Now, if that technology happened to be, uh, say, privacy protecting, well, it will have the same impact, and hopefully, right? But it has to be that groundbreaking technology. So that denotes the space of adoption in the hyper-connected world, and it can be a positive thing or a negative thing depending on what gets popular. Is it a TikTok or something else? So that is what will determine how it gets adopted.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect note to wrap on too. Um, I guess we'll see. Never. I mean, I think if we went back to probably last year's year-end recap, I don't think we probably saw anything that was going to happen in 2023. So we'll see how the next year goes. Generally, yeah, I mean, it'll be an interesting year overall with all this stuff
But,
and the speed things are happening.
or
You
at
were
a
saying
high level, if I have to just say see where I see things going, I certainly see AI shaping privacy, and I think we'll start to see the initial signs of the pendulum swinging towards these on-premise clouds, likely start in the enterprises, as I said. And and the other trend that we have said in the past, which is virtual walls up uh, coming up across various entities, various countries, that trend is likely expected to continue. Be it regulation and whatnot. Some countries will move faster than others. Those are three key trends to watch out for. And of course, I unfortunately, as Tejas mentioned, there is a race to acquire as much data as possible, and that will likely be the case in 2024.
Wow, we
uh,
ended such a happy, positive note.
Well, anyways, I guess Merry Christmas and Happy New Year coming up. I would say stay tuned for next year's plans. I don't think we know what the plans are, but nonetheless, we'll always have a year-end recap because somehow we pull it together in December. But we'll try to do more during the year and keep tabs on more stories. But as always, I guess I haven't said this in a year, but like, share, subscribe seems like the for any kind of updates that actually end up happening. God bless the Brent and his team over there. I don't think it's going to be a good end of the year for you, but whatever it is. But yeah,
Wow.
have a good New Year, Merry Christmas, and I just want to get the last word in so Brent can't snipe back at me before we end. But yeah, thanks for joining, and see y'all again next year.